Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Stories. I know many of you use these episodes to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Story 1. Last year, I went on a road trip to visit a couple of friends I went to high school with. They had moved to the city of Berkeley to study at the University of California, and since then, every summer, I traveled there to see them and spend time together. We studied throughout high school and are practically like brothers. Normally, I fly for that trip, but last year I decided to drive because there were several places along the way I was dying to see. Parks, museums, and historical sites I'd always wanted to visit. I left early that day to make the most of my time and fit in all those stops. The entire route would take me several days, and I wanted to get the most out of the experience. The first 2 days of the trip went smoothly without any issues, but by the third day, I had expected to already be at my destination. However, I was still driving late into the night. It was somewhere between 9 and 10 p.m. By that hour, the highway was pretty empty, and there was barely any traffic, which, while pleasant, also made me feel uneasy, as I've always felt a bit afraid of driving on lonely roads. I still had a few hours to go, and honestly, I just wanted to be at my friend's place as soon as possible. However, I urgently needed to use the bathroom and grab a coffee to wake up a bit. So I pulled off at the next exit where there was a rest area by the highway. This stop was pretty modest, nothing like those large service stations with truck areas and gas pumps. It was just a small building with a row of parking spaces in front of it. But it was good enough for me, so it came in handy. When I arrived, I noticed the place was quite dark and didn't seem to have anyone around, so I parked the car and walked toward the building. I took a moment to stretch since I'd been driving for hours and my muscles were stiff. Inside the building, I saw a hallway with a small cleaning closet, a men's bathroom on one side, and a women's bathroom on the other. There were also a couple of vending machines and a magazine rack. I approached one of the machines looking for an energy drink, and that's when, as I turned around, I noticed another car had pulled into the rest area and parked right next to mine. It struck me as odd, considering there were plenty of empty spaces. Why park right next to mine? I tried not to think much of it and went into the bathroom. I did what I needed to do, and about 5 minutes later, I was on my way out. When I stepped out, I noticed the other car was still there next to mine, with its lights on, which made me think the driver was still inside. I wondered what he might be doing, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I looked back at the vending machine and decided to buy a Red Bull. While drinking it, I couldn't help but glance again at the car parked next to mine. For some reason, I had a bad feeling about it. I looked back at my vehicle and noticed the other car was still running. I started walking toward the exit, but when I was just a few steps from the door, I heard the other car's engine shut off, and a second later, the driver's door opened. Out stepped a tall man with a beard, wearing a brown leather jacket, both hands in his pockets. I froze near the door as I saw him start walking toward me. A wave of tension shot through my body. There was something about this guy that gave me a really bad vibe. Still, I tried to stay calm and appear relaxed, though inside I was very nervous, especially because his eyes were fixed on me, with a truly disturbing stare. When we were just a few feet apart, I stepped away from the door and kept walking toward my car. At some point, we inevitably crossed paths. I greeted him with a slight nod, and he did the same. But just a couple of steps later, I heard the man call out, "Hey!" I turned around only to find myself staring directly into the barrel of a 9mm handgun pointed straight at my face, while the guy had a sinister smile on his face. "Where are you going in such a hurry?" he asked while I struggled to control my breathing, which was starting to speed up. I raised my hands in surrender and asked what he wanted. Without hesitation, he said, "Give me your watch, your wallet, and your phone." I handed everything over without delay, thinking that would be enough and that he'd let me go. But after taking my belongings, he nodded his head, signaling me to follow him. Instead of going back into the building, he made me walk to the back, where the forest began, and we went into the trees. At that moment, my heart was pounding. I was certain that if he'd only wanted to rob me, he he would have left already. But instead he was taking me into the woods, which clearly meant his intentions were something else. I was convinced that for some reason this man wanted to kill me. As we moved deeper into the trees, I asked why he was taking me there, and his only reply was, "Keep walking." I was completely terrified and begged him to please let me go. I told him he could take my car if he wanted, but he didn't say a word. When we had walked about 15 to 20 meters into the forest, he told me to stop and turn around. I did, and we stood face to face, about 2 meters apart. He pointed his gun straight at my face, and I knew this was the end. I was about to die, right there, in the middle of a lonely forest. The only thing that crossed my mind was the pain my parents would feel when they found out what happened. Tears started streaming down my cheeks, and my whole body trembled as that bastard looked at me with eyes full of evil. He told me to get on my knees, and I obeyed, knowing those would be my last seconds of life. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the shot, and then it happened. Bang, bang, bang. 3 gunshots in a row. I covered my ears with both hands and screamed with every blast, falling face down to the ground, crying and in total panic. I'm dead, I thought, but I didn't feel anything. No pain, no wounds. Just the deepest fear I've ever experienced, a terror so intense I felt it in my bones. That's when I heard him laugh. The man was laughing like someone had just told him the funniest joke in the world. While I lay on the ground crying and shaking, he said, "Go home, kid, and don't forget to wash your pants." Then he turned around and walked away, laughing like nothing had happened. At that moment, I started patting myself down frantically, looking for any wounds, but there were none. That's when I realized he hadn't actually shot me. I don't think words are enough to describe what I felt then. It was a brutal mix of terror, relief that I was still alive, and such deep humiliation that I was left paralyzed. It was a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't process, so I just lay there on the ground for several minutes, listening to the sound of his car starting up and driving away until it completely faded into the distance. Only then did I gather the strength to stand up and return to my car. But before that, I went back into the building to wash my face in the bathroom. I looked at myself in the mirror, and what I saw was devastating. My face was red, swollen, and covered with a sticky mix of tears and snot. I was alive, yes, but completely broken inside. My body was still shaking uncontrollably, probably from some kind of nervous shock. After a few minutes, I left the rest stop and drove to the nearest town. There, I managed to borrow a phone and called the police. Later, I told the officers everything that had happened and gave them a detailed description of the guy. That night, I rented a room in that town and stayed there to sleep. The next day, a bit calmer, I got back on the road, but this time without making any more stops. I drove straight to my friend's house. When I arrived, I told them what had happened. They couldn't believe it. They couldn't wrap their heads around how close I had come to losing my life that night. I stayed at my friend's place for a couple of weeks, like I do every year, and during that time I tried to act normal. But deep down, I was still deeply affected. That emotional impact didn't go away for months, and even today, when I think about that night, I feel the exact same emotions that overwhelmed me in that moment. I never heard anything more about the guy who assaulted me and almost killed me. I don't know if the police ever caught him, or if he's still out there terrorizing others. I simply went on with my life. But one thing's for sure, since then, I've never stopped at a rest area again. Story 2. Hi, my name is Dan, and I've been a truck driver for over 25 years. The story I'm going to tell you happened about 4 years ago, and it's something that changed my life forever. It was a rainy night, and I was behind the wheel of my massive truck on the highway, which at that hour, around 4 in the morning, was completely deserted. I was about 4 hours away from the company's warehouse, where I had to deliver a shipment of industrial supplies, when suddenly a torrential downpour came out of nowhere. This made it very difficult to see the road, but after so many years in this profession, I can say I'm pretty used to driving in tough conditions for long stretches. That didn't stop me from feeling annoyed, though, knowing the rain would likely delay the entire trip. However, that heavy storm wasn't the only thing that bothered me that night. For some unknown reason, ever since I got on that last stretch of highway, I had this strange sense of unease. I can't exactly describe what it was. I just felt something was off. Maybe it was the thick silence around me, or the fact that I'd been driving nonstop for hours. Whatever it was, that feeling wouldn't go away. I tried to distract myself by turning on the radio and putting on some music. It helped clear my mind a little, but the unease stayed, like a faint whisper in the back of my consciousness. I kept driving despite the poor visibility, though I reduced my speed out of caution, as I usually do in the rain. A few kilometers ahead, something completely unexpected happened. The rain kept pouring down and the fog was getting thicker when, through the mist, I saw the headlights of a car speeding straight toward me, in the wrong lane. Because of how dense the fog was, I didn't see it until it was practically on top of my truck. On instinct, I swerved hard to avoid the collision, but the wet road made it impossible to regain control. No matter how hard I fought to stabilize the truck, it flipped violently and veered off the road. The last thing I remember was the feeling of floating as the truck spun out of control and the deafening crash as it rolled over. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold asphalt, and everything was a blur. I had intense pain in my head, and my body felt heavy as lead. I tried to move, but couldn't, and I soon realized I was seriously injured and couldn't feel my legs. Dazed, I tried to piece together what had just happened. Slowly, the memories started coming back. The car speeding toward me, the attempt to dodge it, the truck flipping, the crashes, the pain. And now, here I was, lying in the middle of nowhere, hurt and completely alone. I tried to call for help, but my voice was barely a whisper. I was trapped among the wreckage and had no idea how long I'd survive. With what little strength I had left, I screamed out in desperation, but it was no use. Then suddenly I heard footsteps approaching and, in the distance, the sound of a running engine. Moments later, an older man and a young boy walked up to me. They were father and son. They immediately helped me and called an ambulance. There were moments when I felt like I was going to lose consciousness, but I did everything I could to stay awake, knowing that help was finally on the way. Eventually, the ambulance arrived and I was rushed to the hospital. On the way there, I drifted in and out of consciousness, but I remember the paramedics saying I had multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and a serious head injury. They also said I was incredibly lucky to be alive. I couldn't believe it. I had been on the edge of death and didn't know how, or even if, I was going to recover. From what the doctors said, there was a chance these could be my final days. Fortunately, I didn't die, but the recovery process was so painful that at times I wished I hadn't survived. Days turned into weeks, and I remained in the hospital trying to heal. I couldn't move and depended completely on the doctors and nurses. I'd never felt so vulnerable in my entire life. But as the days went on, I began to notice strange things around me. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and feel like someone was watching me. At first, I thought it was a side effect of the head injury, some post-traumatic stress or hallucination. But the more it happened, the more convinced I became that something was wrong. One night, while I was lying in my hospital bed, I saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was a tall, dark silhouette with no distinct features. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure slowly started approaching. I tried to move, but I couldn't. I was overwhelmed with panic and fear. I could feel its cold breath brushing my face. I shut my eyes tight and began to pray. I was so terrified I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I stayed that way for several minutes until, when I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came and the nurses came in, I told them what had happened. They blamed it on sleep paralysis, something that could be linked to my brain injury and stress. But I knew it wasn't that. I knew what I saw was real, not a hallucination like they believed. From that day on, I started seeing the figure more often. It didn't matter if it was day or night. That presence would appear at any moment. You might think I got used to it over time, but I didn't. Every appearance was just as terrifying, and I felt like I was slowly losing my mind. Still, I decided not to talk about it anymore. Instead, I started researching online, convinced that the figure had something to do with the accident. That's when I discovered that on that specific stretch of highway, there had been numerous similar accidents. Many of the victims reported strange experiences. Some said they saw headlights of a car coming straight at them. Others claimed to have seen a figure appear in the middle of the road just before crashing. That's when I knew I wasn't alone, that others had experienced the same thing, and that this figure, this ghost or whatever it was, had caused my accident. I was scared, yes, but also filled with anger. I wanted to understand why it had happened to me, who that presence was, and what it wanted. But first I needed to confirm if what I believed was real. Then I remembered the man who had helped me that night with his son. His name was William. He was the one who called the ambulance and informed my family. Before leaving the hospital, he gave me his phone number and told me I could count on him if I ever needed anything. I couldn't thank him enough. He and his son were like guardian angels that night. However, one thing kept bothering me. William had arrived at the scene almost immediately. That meant he was driving very close behind me, so he should have seen the car that came at me. That same afternoon, I called him and asked directly if he had seen the vehicle. His answer only confirmed my suspicions. He hadn't seen any car. He told me that at the time of the accident, he was a few meters behind my truck when he suddenly saw me swerve hard to the left and begin losing control until I went off the road. But he swore that no car ever passed going the other way, and in fact, he didn't see any other vehicles until the ambulance arrived. Even though I had suspected it, hearing that confirmation chilled me to the bone. That figure, that ghost or whatever it was, had nearly taken my life, just as it had with several other drivers before me. But the strangest thing happened that very same night, around 11 p.m. The figure appeared again at the foot of my bed. Like before, it started to approach, but this time it didn't vanish. Instead, it began to whisper something. It started telling me its story. It revealed to me that in life it had been a truck driver, and that it died in an accident right on that stretch of highway many years ago. It told me it had been driving its truck on a night just as dark and rainy when suddenly, out of nowhere, a car appeared coming the wrong way. Unlike me, it wasn't able to avoid the collision, and both vehicles crashed head-on. No one survived. I was paralyzed. I was about to ask who he was, but at that moment, a nurse entered the room to give me my nighttime treatment. That was the last time I saw the figure. The next day, I decided to look for more information about the accidents on that highway. I spent hours researching until I found a news article from 35 years ago that reported a fatal crash on that very same road. A sedan driver who was under the influence of alcohol had entered the wrong lane and collided head-on with a cargo truck. Both drivers died instantly. The most unsettling part was that there were no details about who those drivers were, and that's when I understood everything. That night, it hadn't been the spirit of the trucker who caused my accident, as I initially believed. It was the soul of the driver of the car, the one who caused the deadly collision decades ago. The saddest part of it all is that both souls probably remain trapped in that tragic moment, unable to rest in peace. Since then, whenever I have the chance, I pray for them. I pray that they can finally find their way to eternal rest. Story 3. My name is Elo Lai, and all of this happened in August 2008. I remember it as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. It was one of the hottest summers we'd had in years, and I was behind the wheel of my old cargo truck, transporting steel sheets bound for a construction site in southern Missouri. By that time, I had over 20 years of truck driving experience, and honestly, I thought I had already seen it all on the road. But what happened that day still haunts me to this day. I was driving down Highway 60, going through a stretch that crosses the Mark Twain National Forest, a truly beautiful place during the day, but quite lonely and even eerie at night. The weather was better than expected, and I planned to stop at a rest area near Springfield to use the bathroom, grab a bite, and maybe get a little sleep before continuing my route. However, just a few miles before reaching that point, I came across an old beat-up pickup truck stopped at the side of the road with the hood up. As I got closer, I saw a burly man waving his arms to get my attention. Among truckers, there's an unspoken rule. We always help each other. So I slowed down, pulled over a bit ahead of him, and got out to see if I could lend a hand. The man looked to be about 45, wearing a flannel shirt that was once white but now completely stained with grease, just like his face and hands. It was clear he'd been trying to fix the vehicle for hours, maybe all day. By then, the sun was starting to set, and before I even got to him, he began walking toward me. "Thank God you stopped," he said, clearly relieved. He shook my hand and introduced himself as Neil. Then he explained that he'd been stranded for 4 or 5 hours, and that apparently the truck's alternator was shot. He asked if I could give him a ride to the nearest town so he could spend the night and try to find a part and a mechanic in the morning. I looked him over for a moment. He didn't seem dangerous, and I didn't have the heart to leave him there. Plus, the next town was only about 20 miles away. Neil went to his truck, grabbed a small travel bag, got into my passenger seat, and we hit the road. Neil turned out to be quite the talker. He told me he was from Alabama and was headed to St. Louis to pick up a load. He also mentioned that his truck had been giving him trouble for weeks, but he thought he could squeeze out a few more miles. About 15 or 20 minutes into the drive, I noticed in my rearview mirror that 2 vehicles were trailing us very closely. At first, I didn't think much of it, just impatient drivers waiting for a chance to pass. But several minutes went by, and they remained directly behind us without trying to overtake, which struck me as odd given we were the only ones on that stretch of highway. I started to feel uneasy and asked Neil if he knew them, nodding toward the rearview mirror. He looked, shook his head, and said he'd never seen them before. I joked, asking if he was running from someone, and he chuckled nervously. But his shaky voice told me he was on edge too, and I couldn't blame him. I was starting to worry myself. From that point on, I kept a close eye on those vehicles. They followed us for about 10 kilometers without ever attempting to pass. The whole thing felt incredibly suspicious. Finally, when we reached a stretch of road surrounded by woods on both sides, the car suddenly sped up and overtook us, then veered sharply and blocked the road completely, forcing me to slam the brakes. "What the hell?" I shouted. The cars stopped right in front of us, and 3 armed men stepped out, walking straight toward my truck. My heart was pounding. I looked at Neil and saw he was pale as a ghost and drenched in sweat. I whispered for him to stay calm and reached for the gun I usually kept under the seat, only to get a bitter surprise. I had left it at home. The company I worked for had recently banned drivers from carrying firearms, and for that reason, I hadn't brought it on recent trips. The 3 men positioned themselves on either side of the truck, pointing their guns at us. One of them yelled for us to get out immediately. I looked at Neil again. He looked like he was about to pass out. With my hands raised, I told them we didn't want any trouble, and they could take whatever they wanted. But the same guy barked again, now more aggressively, ordering us to get out. We obeyed slowly. Neil stumbled as he got down and nearly fell. One of the men told us to move to the side of the road, keeping their weapons trained on us. They ordered us to empty our pockets. We handed over our wallets, phones, and keys. "You can take the truck if you want, just please leave us alone," I said. "Shut up," one of them snapped. They took our belongings, tossed them into one of the cars, and then returned to us. One of them threw me the truck keys and motioned for me to start it up. Confused, I looked at Neil, who seemed just as puzzled. The guy warned us not to try anything. I got back in the truck with one of them still pointing a gun at me. I started the engine. Then another guy motioned for Neil to get into one of the cars. It was clear they were separating us. I had no idea what their plan was, but I wasn't in a position to argue with an armed man. So I began driving behind the car that had Neil and 2 of the attackers, while the 3rd man followed us in the second vehicle. We drove for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably about 20 minutes. They led us down a narrow dirt road off the highway that wound deep into the forest. My mind raced, searching for escape routes, but there was nothing I could do. And even if I could get away, I couldn't just leave Neil behind. I knew they'd likely heard him. The trees closed in tighter around us, and I knew we were being led into a trap. Eventually, the vehicle stopped in a clearing in the middle of the woods. The men got out with weapons drawn and ordered me to exit the truck. I did, trembling, my heart pounding against my ribs. If they'd brought us this far, it was clear they didn't plan to let us go. If they only wanted to rob us, they could have done it on the road and left. The man who seemed to be the leader motioned for me to follow him into the woods. Neil was already ahead, led by one of the other men, a short, stocky guy with a wicked look that sent chills down my spine. He gave me a twisted, sinister smile. We walked for several minutes until we reached an old abandoned cabin. My stomach churned at the sight. They shoved us inside, where the only furniture was a couple of beat-up chairs and a lot of trash. They ordered us to sit on a dusty couch. "What do you want from us?" I asked the one who seemed to be in charge, trying to keep my voice steady. The guy with the devilish face grinned and said, "Just make sure you don't go running to the cops." Then he turned to his companions and they all started laughing. After that, they began tying our hands and feet. I felt a cold sweat run down my back. One of them joked, "Don't try to escape, okay?" The three of them laughed as they walked out of the cabin and shut the door behind them. As soon as they left, I started struggling against the ropes. "We have to get out of here," I told Neil, who was white as a sheet and trembling uncontrollably. "They're going to kill us, all right?" he replied, his voice cracking. "Not if we get out before they come back," I said, trying to sound confident, though I was terrified inside. I moved my wrists forcefully, trying to loosen the knots. It was slow and painful, but little by little, I felt the ropes give way. Then we heard the sound of a car starting. We waited in silence, holding our breath until they were gone. Once free, I quickly untied Neil. He thanked me, and to lighten the mood, I said, "Save it for when we're actually safe." He nodded and we stumbled out of the cabin together. It was nighttime and visibility was near zero, but we noticed the cars and my truck were gone. Neil asked if I knew the way back, but honestly, we'd walked so far into the forest I only had a vague sense of where we were. I told him if we walked in the opposite direction of the cabin, we'd likely find the road. So that's what we did. We eventually made it back to the highway, though we started to wonder if staying there was a good idea. The fear that those guys might return was eating away at us, but if we wanted help, we couldn't hide in the woods forever. We walked along the edge of the road, ready to dart into the trees if any suspicious vehicle showed up. The moon barely lit the trees and the pavement. I kept my ears alert for any sign of a car approaching. After what felt like forever, we heard the faint hum of an engine. A chill ran down my spine. What if it was them again? I pulled Neil down, and we hid in the underbrush, crouching and holding our breath. But when the car passed slowly, we saw it was just an old beat-up sedan driven by an older man who looked like a local. I stood up, waving my arms and shouting, "Hey, please." The vehicle stopped, and the driver rolled down the window, eyeing us suspiciously. "What's going on here?" he asked cautiously. "Please, we need help," I said, briefly explaining that we'd been robbed and kidnapped and needed to call the police since they took our phones and belongings. The man looked us over for a few seconds, then nodded and said, "Get in. I'll take you to the sheriff." We got in, exhausted and relieved. He introduced himself as Jeff and drove us to a small town called Ellington, where he dropped us off at the sheriff's office. There we gave full statements, describing the three men and everything that had happened. The sheriff, a hardened veteran named Stewart, took the case very seriously. "We'll send out a patrol. We'll find your truck. And those guys too," he assured us firmly. "You're lucky to be alive," he added. And he was absolutely right. Neil and I looked at each other. We were alive, but completely shaken. The sheriff's deputies took us back to the forest clearing, but there was no trace of the men. However, minutes later, one of the officers reported over the radio that they had found my truck abandoned among the trees untouched. "Stay alert," the sheriff warned us as we prepared to leave. They could come back at any moment. We thanked him and got back on the road, this time heading to the nearest rest area. We needed to report what happened to our companies, but more than anything, we needed rest. As I drove, I couldn't stop thinking about how close we came to dying that night. I always considered myself a tough guy, but that experience shook me to my core. Neil sat in silence, staring out the window, lost in thought. We said goodbye at the truck stop, exchanged numbers, and promised to keep in touch, but we never saw each other again. Still, I think about him every time I drive through southern Missouri. That night changed me forever. Now I'm much more cautious, more aware of the dangers that lurk on the road. I still help when I can, but I never let my guard down. And sometimes when I drive through those dark, lonely stretches, I remember those men, and I wonder if they were ever caught or if they're still out there, waiting for their next victim. But I don't let that consume me. Life goes on, and so do I. After all, the road has always been my place, and as long as there are loads to haul and destinations to reach, I'll keep going, no matter what the road has in store, because a trucker is always moving, and always alert for the unexpected. Story 4. My name is Ernesto, and what I'm about to tell you happened on a night when I experienced the most terrifying situation of my life. At the time, I was working night shifts in Arizona, basically in the middle of nowhere, at an old ranch that had been converted into a hotel. It was a good place to work. In fact, I'd say it was probably the easiest job I ever had. The only downside was that every morning I had to drive an hour and a half to get back home. Honestly, I hated it at first. It took up a big chunk of my free time and left me completely drained. But eventually I just got used to it. One night during my usual drive home, I decided to stop at a taco truck that was roughly halfway along my route. I was starving and couldn't hold out until I got home. The truck was set up right outside a small RV park, so I assumed the owner either lived there or just showed up every night to sell tacos. That taco truck had been operating in that spot for about 2 months. I'd seen it plenty of times before, but I never stopped, mainly because I was always in a rush since my commute was over 100 miles. But that night my hunger was killing me. My stomach was growling nonstop. So when I saw the sign from afar, I exited the highway and pulled into the RV park. I got out of my car and walked up to the taco truck. To my surprise, the guy made some of the best tacos I'd ever had in my life. I ordered them to go and ate them in my car. Maybe it was just the hunger talking, but they tasted like heaven. That night I drove home feeling like I just discovered a hidden gem. And the next day, I stopped again, and again the night after that. I can't say I went every single day, but it definitely became a regular part of my commute. I no longer scarfed them down in the car out of desperation. I'd stand next to the truck, enjoy them slowly, try the different salsas the guy offered, finish off with a soda and a cigarette, and he always gave me those lemon-scented wet wipes that I kept in the car for cleaning up on the road. Honestly, I must have stopped there 40 or 50 times over the next few months, and despite all those visits and how often I chatted with the guy, I never learned his name. I didn't ask for it the first time, and then I just never did. Looking back, that makes me feel kinda rude. But hey, he never asked for mine either, so I guess it didn't bother him. I was just another regular customer. The point is, I wish I had asked, because the night that information became crucial, I didn't have it, and I was mad at myself for never asking. That night I parked my car in the same spot as always. I got out and walked toward the truck. Everything seemed normal at first, but it wasn't. It was the first time I'd gone there, and the taco guy wasn't in the truck. There weren't any other customers either. Apparently, I was the only one there at the time. Better for me, I thought. I waited a few minutes, figuring maybe he was checking the tires or had just arrived and was still setting things up. But after several minutes with no sign of life, I approached the truck and started calling out to him. No response. I also realized that everything around me was unusually quiet. Not a soul on the road, no lights on in the RV homes. Total silence. As I kept looking around impatiently, I noticed something strange. I began to smell something burning. I stood on my toes to try to see if anything was on the grill, but I couldn't quite reach. Even though I couldn't see anything, the smell of burning was unmistakable. And then I saw smoke. Yes, something was definitely burning up there, and while I didn't know what it was, the sizzling sound from the grill was crystal clear. I shouted something like, "Hey, something's burning up here." But again, no response, just the sound of something burning on the grill. And it's not like I'm short, but this taco truck was big. One of those fully equipped rigs, not a small ice cream style cart. That's why I couldn't see what was on the grill from the ground. I was starting to feel frustrated, but also concerned. Something was burning, and if it kept going, it could set the whole truck on fire. And I'm not exaggerating. Just one spark, and boom, the truck's gone. What bothered me most was knowing that this truck was probably all that guy had. His livelihood, his daily grind. I liked him. I liked his tacos. I liked how he'd nod with empathy when I vented about work. But more than anything, I respected his consistency. He was always there every night, working hard. And that means something because nowadays reliability is hard to find. When you find it, even in the form of a late-night taco truck, you appreciate it. I thought, if I were him, I'd want someone to shut off the grill or the gas before I lost everything. I didn't know where he was or if he'd had some kind of medical emergency, but I did know I didn't want to see his truck go up in flames. So I walked around to the entrance of the truck. It had a narrow door with some retractable steps. I climbed up, grabbed the handle, opened the door, and the first thing I saw was the cash register wide open, the drawer hanging down, with coins scattered everywhere. My first thought was robbery, but there were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass or anything that suggested violence. Maybe someone had threatened him with a weapon, told him to run, and then emptied the register before fleeing. That idea made me angry. That man worked hard, probably bought that truck with years of sweat, and now some loser had just taken everything, probably to blow it on drugs. But at least I thought it didn't seem like anyone had gotten hurt. That's what I believed, until I moved toward the grill to shut it off. To reach the grill, I had to step further inside and climb a couple of metal steps. The grill was to my left, and when I turned my head to see what was burning, I felt my heart stop completely. And then came the panic. What was burning on that grill was a human hand, completely charred, black as coal, with fingers curled and twisted from the heat. A perfect, instantly recognizable shape. My reaction was so intense I fell backwards down the stairs, though I somehow kept my balance and didn't hit the ground. As soon as I could, I avoided looking again, opened the lower compartment of the grill, and shut off the flame. Then I went straight back to the truck's door, closed it, stepped down, and walked straight to my car. To call the police. I didn't really know what to say to the operator. I just knew there had clearly been a robbery. Someone had been seriously injured, and I had no idea where they were or what condition they were in. And the worst part, I didn't even know his name. That was the most frustrating thing. I wanted to help, but I didn't even know how to search for him. I told the operator everything I could, and they said they'd send officers to the scene to take over. Technically, I didn't need to stay, but I decided to. I wanted to be sure the taco guy would show up eventually, even if he had his arm in a bandage, something to prove he was alive. But no one came. I waited maybe 30 or 40 more minutes, maybe close to an hour, and neither the taco guy nor the police ever showed up. Finally, I left. I drove home feeling numb, my head spinning, unable to stop thinking about everything I had just seen. I couldn't understand why the officers didn't show up with sirens blaring, knowing something so horrifying had happened. And what kept gnawing at me most was not knowing his name. If I had known it, maybe I could have searched it, helped find him, done something more useful. I tried searching online with phrases like "taco man burned by thief" or similar, but all I found were random violent crime stories that didn't match what I saw that night. In the days that followed, I never saw the taco truck again. It was removed from the spot, and I never heard anything else about the man. All I can do now is hope that wherever he is, he's okay. Story 5. All of this happened 6 years ago. sometime in June 2018. At that time, I decided to take an impromptu solo trip for a day. I've always loved exploring, and there were a couple of places relatively close by that were still on my list to visit before heading back to college in August. The plan was simple. Wake up early, hit the road, visit a few interesting spots during the day, and then drive back home around 9 p.m. That way I could make the most of the day without having to pay for a hotel night and save a good chunk of money in the process. The drive there went smoothly, but the return was a completely different story. I ended up leaving around 10 at night. According to Apple Maps, the estimated drive time back was about 4.5 hours. I had made it about halfway when I started to feel the accumulated exhaustion. I tried to stay awake by washing my face several times with water from my canteen, but it was useless. At one point, continuing to drive became dangerous. I promised myself that as soon as I saw a rest stop, I'd pull over and take a 1-hour nap before continuing. That way I'd still make it home at a reasonable time. And I kept my word. A few kilometers later, I saw a rest area and pulled into the parking lot. The first thing I noticed was that there wasn't a single car. The place was completely empty. If it hadn't been for a few lights on, I would have thought it was abandoned. But it made sense. It was late, and that highway wasn't exactly heavily trafficked. I leaned back in my seat and set an alarm to wake me up in an hour. When the alarm went off, I realized I now had to use the bathroom. As always, my bladder ruining my plans. So I got out of the car and headed toward the building. Once inside, I found the bathrooms, opened one of the stalls, and went in. I hadn't even been there 30 seconds when I started hearing voices outside in the hallway. That caught me off guard, since I hadn't heard the main door open, and just a minute earlier, I was the only one there. How had someone gotten in so quickly? At that moment, the bathroom door opened. I was already a little uneasy, but I figured it was probably just another normal person, someone I hadn't noticed arrive, so I didn't think much of it. I was about to leave when I heard soft tapping on the stall door. I responded awkwardly, "Someone's in here," but there was no reply, just complete silence. Now I was nervous. I decided to stay inside the stall until the person left. That's when I noticed an eye staring at me through the gap in the door. And just as we made eye contact, the guy started screaming and slamming his head against the door, over and over again, like a lunatic. "What the hell?" I whispered, as fear began to take over. Thinking fast, I used my whole body to brace the door, trying to keep him from breaking in. But seeing that he wasn't stopping the screaming and headbanging, I flung the door open and shoved him hard, knocking him down. Then I ran out of the bathroom as fast as I could and bolted toward my car. I was halfway through the parking lot when I heard the main door open behind me. I turned to look, and sure enough, that guy was running after me. Luckily, I was faster. I made it to my car, started it immediately, and began to back out. But the guy managed to reach me and threw himself against the door just as I sped off. In the rearview mirror, I saw him get up as if nothing had happened, standing there motionless, staring at me as I drove away. I was completely shaken. I couldn't process what had just happened. You always hear terrifying stories like this, but you never think it's going to happen to you. After leaving the rest stop, I was so rattled that I probably sped for several miles. The rest of the trip was a blur of tension, adrenaline, and fear. Clearly, I didn't get another second of sleep that night. My body was full of energy, but not the good kind. It was the kind you get from pure terror and the overwhelming need to escape something you can't explain. To this day, I have no idea who that guy was, where he came from, or what his deal was. If I had to guess, I'd say he was probably a homeless man with mental health issues. But then again, what was someone like that doing in the middle of nowhere next to a deserted highway? None of it made sense. How did he get there? What was he looking for? I don't know. The only thing I know for sure is that I've never stopped at a rest area again since that night. And if I can help it, I never will.